Hello, I'm Ronnie Eldridge. Welcome to Eldridge and Company. The Legal Aid Society is a priceless part of our city's democracy. Its lawyers are the most underrated and underpaid in the profession. Their work is never easy. They challenge an indictment or form a class action against an outrage. And all I can say is thank heavens we have them. Steve Banks is the Society's attorney-in-chief and an old friend of mine from city council days, and so I'm welcome, and I'm very glad you're here.
Thanks for having me on today. I appreciate it.
You were I heard you go to the city council hearings day in and day out about homeless people and their housing, both families and individuals?
Yes.
Yes. So what's changed?
Well, the time we're living in now is extraordinary, so it's hard to say what could change. I think in the world that we're in, you really need the kind of solutions to finally put an end to homelessness, and it's a lot about what's being talked about, certainly on the national level, about income support, about the need for jobs, and about the need to prevent homelessness. Those are the kind of values that we're hearing from Washington right now, and those are the kinds of things that are going to come to grips with what is really an unprecedented problem in the city.
Right.
We've got record numbers of families with children seeking shelter. That's reflective of the economy. We've still got high numbers of single adults in the shelter system. It came down somewhat in prior years, but seems to be heading back up. I know the city's done a count recently of the numbers of homeless people on the streets and the subways, and I think New Yorkers have to really focus on what they see with their own eyes and hear with their own ears in terms of what they think, whether homelessness is getting better or worse or staying the same on the streets.
The city's count showed a decrease, and they lauded it as indicative of the success of their program, but that's not what I hear around.
I think you saw increases in adults seeking shelter beginning in the cold period in December. The numbers of people seeking shelter across the city also lag a little bit behind the unemployment, and we have employment heading into double digits in the city as it is in the state and nationally. We're looking at just a tidal wave of humanity that needs help. And as I said, even before some of the worst of the meltdown hit, you had record numbers of families seeking shelter over the summer. And the mayor set an ambitious goal of reducing by 2/3 the size of the shelter system, and it's come down very, very little in terms of the family side. And it's really because people don't have the income to afford the rents that are there, and there isn't enough public subsidies being provided to get people out of the shelter system, and enough of a helping hand in terms of the kind of income that you need to actually pay rent.
It's such an all-over problem. I mean, the solution is not a simple thing, like finding a shelter bed and putting a person there or a temporary unit. I mean, as you said, the rents are higher, the taxes are higher, the cost of living is higher. So I read, I think, that there was some interest in the state legislature about returning to some kind of rent control, rent stabilization?
Well, the legislature is looking to return the authority to New York City to be able to control its own destiny in terms of rent regulations. I mean, it's an odd situation in which the state legislature determines what the city can set in terms of housing policy, and there's been progressive legislation in the Assembly, and we're hopeful that it will pass the Senate as well, and put an end to a situation in which New York City tenants have been dependent upon people who are elected not by New York City residents to make determinations about housing policy.
But you still have the board that decides the increase in rent stabilization, and isn't that city?
That's city set. There have been two factors that have been driving people out of their homes. One is deregulation, so-called high rent deregulation of getting apartments to rent for more than $2,000, in part by making improvements that don't turn out to cost as much as they should have cost, and a whole range of problems relating to that. And then on the other hand, the problem of rent increases being voted, notwithstanding the fact that tenants can't pay in this environment. But if you really go back to basics and take the minimum wage, multiply it by 35, and then see in your newspaper what prevailing rents are, you'll see that that's a major producer of homelessness. Right. When you've got a gap between income and prevailing rents, you'll have homelessness, and that's the world we're living in.
Right. It's an incredible thing that we can't fundamentally approach it. But maybe, I guess, of all the times that we've seen, this may be the most hopeful
It
on a
may
federal
be.
level?
It may be, because you've got a federal administration coming in with an attitude that we can't do business as usual. We have to solve these things. You know, our original clients at the Legal Aid Society, I'm almost embarrassed to say, in the early 1980s, came in to say, why could the government spend, you know, thousands of dollars to put me up in a shelter when, but for a couple $100 to subsidize my rent, I could remain in permanent housing, or I could even find an apartment. And the more that the administration of Washington now thinks about making Section 8 available, the rent subsidy program, and dollars available for sensible housing solutions, then of course we've got to get New York City to actually implement those sensible solutions. So it doesn't make any sense that the neediest group of people in the city, homeless families with children, aren't the highest priority for federal rental assistance. They don't have any greater priority. The thinking was that families with children were coming into the shelter system to get Section 8. They took Section 8 eligibility away from homeless families in December 2004. Guess what? The numbers have continued to skyrocket.
So in other words, if you're a homeless family in a shelter, you can't get a Section 8 certificate?
You can go on the waiting list. You don't have a priority. You don't have the highest priority, even though you're the neediest person. So
who else goes on a waiting list for
people
Section 8?
That might be doubled up, people that might be living in other housing circumstances, but people who have already fallen through the safety net. They've negotiated through the city's eligibility process, which the city says is terrific in weeding out people that don't need shelter. So you're now talking about the people that the city itself has said, these people really need shelter. Those people don't qualify.
But we're in no hurry to give it to them.
Right. Well, it's, you know, if you step back, in a famine, you give the needy, you give the people who are the hungriest the food.
Yeah.
So in a housing famine, the people who are homeless are the equivalent of the neediest, and they should be eligible for that.
And the justification is the people who've gone into the system not really needing it any more than anybody else.
That was the justification, but it simply doesn't wash with the facts. Yeah. First, the decision to delink eligibility from Section 8 for homeless families was in December 2004. And what we've seen is record numbers of families seeking shelter since that time. In the immediate aftermath of the policy change, there was some instability in the numbers of families seeking shelter for a month or two. But thereafter, you've seen these incredible numbers of families seeking shelter. So there's clearly no relationship between one and the other. And also, as I said, you've got the city touting its eligibility process. So if their eligibility process is so good, how could it possibly be that people who don't really need shelter would get into shelter in order simply to get Section 8? Meanwhile, we're paying thousands of dollars a month to keep people in shelter, and if we can make use of available Section 8 certificates that the federal government is providing to New York City, we could be moving people out of the shelter system.
Section 8, let's just go back, because you know this so well. And
it's jargon.
It's the whole thing that comes out, right. Section 8 is a certificate that the federal government funds.
Right. The federal government has had really two kinds of housing programs over the years. One was what we call public housing apartments, bricks and mortar, and the other is the Section 8 program, in which the government either subsidizes a whole housing development or gives tenants the ability to rent an apartment on the private market and then get a subsidy filling the gap between a percentage of their income and what the rent actually is. Ironically, the Section 8 program was developed by President Nixon, great progressive apparently, but it was a program that really is in many respects been underutilized for years. The federal government now seems committed to it once again, and we've got to make sure the city makes the best use of those subsidies by giving it to the people who are the neediest.
There's another pressure, though, that comes from the landlords also, isn't there?
Well, there are issues whether or not landlords want to accept Section 8, right. And we brought litigation enforcing a city council ordinance that prohibits income discrimination, because we had run into problems. Terrific lawyers at Legal Aid, Judith Goldner and Ellen Davidson, really identified these problems, and they worked with members of the city council and adopted a terrific piece of legislation that prevents discrimination based upon source of income. So the fact that you have a Section 8 certificate it cannot be a basis for turning you down. So
now, do you have a case pending about homeless families?
What we have is a final judgment in the homeless families case. After 25 years.
It only takes 25 years.
The city finally agreed to an order that'll go on forever, no matter who the mayor is, that requires the city to provide shelter and that requires that the shelter be adequate. And so that's enforceable. If it's violated, we'll return to court. Hopefully we won't. But it was a long struggle to get the city of New York to finally agree to that proposition.
But it doesn't stop the practice of not giving precedence to families that are in shelters.
For Section 8, no. It touches on the basic question of whether or not families with children who have no other place to go are entitled to shelter, which they are, and whether the city is liable legally to provide shelter to them, which the city is now, and whether or not the quality has to meet basic standards, which it does.
So are you doing anything about moving the families out of the shelter? Or is that in consideration, or shouldn't I even ask?
Well, we're responsive. You know, the Legal Aid Society, I know you know this, is not an organization that sits around vindicating principles. We represent real flesh and blood people. And as our clients bring to us problems, if we have to enforce that injunction because of congestion, if you will, in the shelter system and children suffering as a result, would certainly do that.
So the Legal Aid Society is divided into 4 different segments. It's criminal. Oh, it's 3.
It's 3.
No, it's 4. Criminal, civil, juvenile, and civil rights, the class action.
Well, actually, it's criminal, it's civil, it's juvenile rights, and then we have law reform in each of the practices.
I see. So it's mixed.
Right. The law reform is the kind of work that we have a homeless rights project, we have a prisoners' rights project, we have law reform units that do criminal and juvenile and civil work. If you're arrested in New York City, you have a right to be brought before a judge within 24 hours and be arraigned or released. That's as a result of a legal aid lawsuit. And there are similar cases in all of the areas of practice that we've been involved with.
Remember during the Giuliani administration, I don't know if it still happens now, where I remember a constituent of mine was stopped by the police because her rear light was not working. And then one thing went into another, and she ended up in jail for, I don't know, even chained to the bars.
Well, unfortunately, there is still a lot of focus on, shall we say, low-level crimes, quality-of-life crimes like the one you just described. And although we have the pronouncements that crime is down, arrests are actually up. Crime is down because the analysis of crime is only the most serious 7 crimes, the so-called FBI indicated crimes. So murder, rape, serious crimes, those are down. But arrests for, I would just say, offenses that shouldn't really even be brought to court are up. And so your friend who was arrested under the prior administration could also be arrested under the current administration. And that's driving the caseloads, which is having a dramatic impact, I should add, on the work of our lawyers. In 2002, our lawyers handled 197,000 cases, 435 lawyers. This current year, we're handling 227,000 cases. That's 435 staff lawyers with supervisory backup, of course, social workers, investigators, handling 227,000 cases. We have an intolerable situation in which the appellate division, first department, says our lawyers should handle no more than a certain...
That's a state judicial thing that's always a mystery to non-lawyers.
It's the court oversight that lawyers work under. The appellate court has said that criminal defense lawyers in a given year should only handle a certain number of cases. It's either 400 misdemeanors, low-level crimes, or 150 serious crimes, and if it's a mixed caseload, you weight the felonies so that in the end it's 400. But the average caseload that our lawyers have is 592. That's 81% of our lawyers have more cases than the First Department standards permit. It's just an intolerable situation to continue to work under.
So you're lobbying for a ceiling on it?
Yeah, we have a number of different efforts, and I have to say that elected officials have been very responsive to the basic proposition. New Yorkers have a constitutional right to counsel. And part of that constitutional right is they should get a lawyer that doesn't have too many cases. And the appellate division have said how many cases a lawyer should handle. So if in the end our lawyers have too many cases, there's a problem there. And we've been trying to work with our elected officials to really address this crisis.
So does that mean then that you would then seek more money from more lawyers, or will you give your cases to somebody else?
Well, we think we provide the highest quality representation to people who can't afford a lawyer, and therefore we are very interested in keeping the cases that are assigned to us. But we want to make sure that our lawyers aren't assigned more cases on an individual basis than is proper under the appellate division. There's almost by alchemy, a yearly process in which it's determined what our budget's going to be.
Yeah.
And having a standard that says you need to have only this many cases for each lawyer actually enforced would take the mystery out of the budget process, and you'd have to have X number of lawyers based upon X number of cases.
So you need X number of dollars.
Right.
So where do you get the money, from the state and the city?
It's a combination of state and city funding. It's a state constitutional obligation. The city, as in so many instances, is sort of left to implement the state constitutional obligation, but it is really a state obligation.
And what's the budget? The total budget?
Our total organizational budget is $160 million. Our total budget for the criminal defense area, or the criminal practice area, has been roughly $98 million, and we've taken cuts steadily down to almost $93 million and heading towards $92 million in the coming year. So
and
we've been
much
taking
of that
substantial
comes from the
cuts.
State?
From the state, roughly $11 million comes from the state. The rest comes from the city.
So every year, I remember seeing you on the steps of City Hall, and I gather you go up to the steps in Albany, and you have to stand around and corral each member to talk to them to make your case for more money.
That's correct. That doesn't seem right, does it?
No, it doesn't.
So if you had a law that said this is the number of cases that each individual lawyer should handle, the funding would be driven by that law. Clients would get appropriate services, and we wouldn't have to be groveling for funding for a constitutional service. This isn't an optional service, it's a constitutional service.
Do you, what's the average salary of an attorney? Is there such a thing?
Well, our lawyers start at $53,000. These are lawyers that could make, even in the tough market that we're currently in, 3 times that.
Well, they could make that in a summer job while they're still in law school.
Yeah, although in fairness, the law industry is going through a very difficult time right now in the city.
But everybody is. So, yeah.
But it's.
And what's the top? Is there a top? You just
if they're there, 25 years, 30 years, they're going to make about $100,000.
So what kind of people go into legal aid?
Very committed, very dedicated people who believe passionately in serving their clients and believe passionately in the cause of justice. And I'm very proud to be the person who, in the end, comes on and pleads their case before the council and before the state legislature. It's a great staff that we have.
Have you always worked for legal aid?
I went right from the maternity room to the Legal Aid Society 28 years ago, right after I was born.
No, seriously.
Yes, I've only went to the Legal Aid Society.
So you went to law school, and you knew you were going to go into this kind of law?
I wanted to go into this kind of law. I had 2 choices in college. Don't laugh. I was either going to become a rabbi or a lawyer.
That's very fitting. I could tell that.
As my mother said, you kind of became a rabbi. You became a legal aid lawyer.
Right. It's the same thing. I always thought when I was a politician, if I really believed in it, I could be a rabbi also. That would be very hard. But what do you think makes the difference with somebody like you and a law student who then goes immediately, did you intern in a law firm when you were in college?
I interned at the Legal Aid Society.
So what makes the difference? Where does the social consciousness or something come from?
Well, I think it's not entirely a social conscious issue. I think debt is a huge problem. The educational costs, both for college and law school, that people emerge with is just staggering.
Yeah.
And the ability to work for $53,000 a year as your starting salary when you have, 7 years worth of educational debt potentially on your shoulders is a huge problem. Now,
but we don't misinterpret that only millionaires work for the Legal Aid Society.
No, they don't. No, they don't.
All right.
No, they don't. Hardworking people who are struggling to get by, and obviously we have the UAW ably represents the lawyers, and 1199 SCIU ably represents the support staff, and I readily concede that we have difficulty difficulty paying what they're worth. But the debt that people are emerging with, even our social workers too, the debt is huge. And yes, there are various loan forgiveness programs, but not the kind of programs that we need. The state Senate implemented loan forgiveness for district attorneys, prosecutors around the state when it was Republican controlled. And one of the issues now is, well, how about loan forgiveness for public defenders?
There's a loan forgiveness for prosecutors, but not for the other side.
Yes.
Well,
Yes.
isn't that unconstitutional?
Well, it's certainly part
of. Is that a
of
question of equality or equal pay for? What's the thing that women want? You know, I don't know.
Well, I think you're onto something here.
Yeah.
In the federal system,
Yeah.
there's comparability in terms
work,
of
right.
But there's a concept that the federal defenders and the assistant U.S. attorneys are going to be paid comparably, have the same kind of benefits, same kind of pension assistance, and so forth, so that you could make a career out of it. For example,
or somebody, do they?
well,
federal employees.
There are federal. They can be federal employees, but the concept is that the prosecution and the defense is going to have parity of wages and parity of benefits, and that's what clearly we need in the state system, so that our lawyers have parity.
And especially since it's constitutionally mandated that you be there.
Right. No, that's absolutely right.
That's incredible to me. Why haven't you brought a suit about it?
You know, Ronnie, if I could find a legal claim, I don't want to prejudice the ability to find one in the future by having someone play this tape that there wasn't such a claim. There may well be, but it's definitely a great concern. Because there's an unfairness. The government already has all the powers of the police department, the FBI, the fire department, all of the array of the state, if you will, to investigate and prosecute somebody. We have the passion of our lawyers, the passion of our investigators, our social workers, our paralegals, our supervisors, but there's an inequity of resources, but there's also an inequity in terms of compensation, and that really has to be addressed if we're going to have a fair system.
There's a system for interns, isn't there, for tuition forgiveness for medical students?
Yeah, and there
if
are.
you work in certain in city hospitals or something?
And there are developing loan forgiveness programs that various law schools have put in place, but we really need a comprehensive program that's going to say, if you're going to be a public defender, if you're going to be a civil legal services lawyer, if you're going to be a juvenile rights lawyer, you're going to have not have to cope with these debts, and at the same time you're going to be paid on a comparable level and get the benefits that are comparable to the people on the other side.
Another aside is that you're basically like a graduate school, aren't you, for lawyers? I mean, lawyers, not all lawyers stay at the Legal Aid Society.
Well, our longevity you'd be surprised at. Both on our civil and criminal side, for example, the average tenure is in excess of 10 years. And I think that's a tribute to the dedication of the lawyers who work under very difficult circumstances, but believe in what they do and do an excellent job at what they do.
It's very good. Now, what kind of civil cases do you take?
You name the problem.
Is that housing, eviction?
We do it. It's income issues. So right now we're being deluged with people of unemployment problems who are trying to get benefits. Somebody called me or spoke to me on behalf of somebody who had come off of one of the national campaigns, and they were having trouble getting unemployment benefits. So you can see that it's a difficult process to negotiate. Disability benefits, consumer matters, housing matters, domestic violence, family law, immigration, HIV, homelessness. I'm sure I'm leaving something out. Tax issues. At this moment, we're seeing all of the issues that the economic downturn are producing for low-wage workers in particular. And that's getting basic benefits, subsistence benefits, food stamps, Medicaid. We have a big effort involved with providing services in the healthcare area, helping people who are low-wage taxpayers deal with all of those issues relating to tax credits and overpayment claims, which frequently have no basis. As I said, disability benefits, low-wage workers just trying to collect their wages, people trying to get public assistance benefits and being turned away.
Totally reflects the state of the world.
It reflects all of the problems you can see. We have senior citizens to very young children on the civil side.
Where do you have immigration?
On our civil side, we represent immigrants with immigration-related problems. We represent immigrants who have every other problem, who are being having difficulty getting their wages, who may be evicted, who are survivors of domestic violence. One of the sad facts on the civil side, though, is there is no right to counsel. So on our juvenile rights side, we represent children in family court, and there's a constitutional right to children who are the subjects of abuse or neglect or charged with delinquency. In criminal proceedings, there's a right to counsel. It may not be adequately funded, but there is a right. On the civil side, there is no right. So you could lose your home, you could be faced with deportation, you could be faced with losing access to health care, you could be faced with losing basic critical subsistence needs, and you still have no right to counsel. And as a result of lack of resources, we can only help 1 out of every 7 New Yorkers that come to us for help. And there we're facing a huge crisis on the civil side, and I'm hopeful that the state legislature and the governor will be able to respond to this, as well as the city council when the time comes. We've received funding from something called the Interest on Lawyers Account Fund. You know, when interest rates were going well, it was going well. Governor Spitzer, remember him, he signed a law that made the interest rates comparable for these accounts, and additional dollars came in. The Legal Aid Society has an annual grant of $4.5 million from IOLA. Well, guess what? There's no interest rates now, and economic activity has dried up, so there's not a lot of money going into the interest on lawyers' accounts. And so we're looking at literally in months, when 2010 starts, a drying up of that $4.5 million.
You have a website, and it's, I think we said, did we say it? What is it? www.legal-aid.org. And on it, you describe all your work.
Including how you can make a contribution to us.
I was going to say, including how you can make a contribution. And do you put any alerts down about pending legislation that would help you, so that people might be able then to write to their legislators, or to you know, organize some grassroots support for you? Well,
what we do is we have testimony, we have news, we have, you know, if you went on our website now, you'd find a lot of the issues that I just described to you, the need for criminal defense case caps, the problem with crisis with funding on the civil legal services side, and the real crisis looming if something isn't done about the loss of the IOLA funding. It's $25 million across the state, 4.5 for our organization. So all of that information is there.
So we hope people will certainly look at it and then make a contribution. And we're at the end of our half hour. I wish we could go on forever, because there are all kinds of things I wanted to talk about. But thank you, Steve Banks. And maybe when the budget period is over, you'll come back.
Anytime.
Thank
Always
you.
Good to see you.
If there are any people you'd like to hear and topics you'd like us to explore, please let me know. You can write to me at CUNY TV, 365 Fifth Avenue, New York, New York, 10016, or you can go to the website at cuny.tv and click on Contact Us. I look forward to hearing from you.